out. They're having to pay more and more money to, in effect, mercenaries. And we discussed the last time that we spoke about Chinese mercenaries. The Ukraine mercenaries have all but gone now. And what it means is that the Russians are now having to recruit or conscript sons predominantly of the more wealthy Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg, who actually, have a voice in the Putin government, and that is becoming increasingly unpopular. It is also pretty clear that the Russian economy can not sustain this war for very much longer, especially if the price of oil continues to drop, which is the bedrock of the money that Putin is getting in to finance his war machine. He just cannot keep going without hard currency to be able to do that, whatever people might think. So there are murmurings in Moscow of discontent now with Putin and with his campaign. And Russian dictators who fail rarely last long, rarely collect their pensions. So I'm sure this is driving Putin as well, realizing that actually, for all the effort he's put in over the last 6 months, he hasn't made a great deal of ground. He's lost thousands and thousands of soldiers and lost a lot of military hardware too. So he was perhaps hoping that the ceasefire and peace talks would come about and give him all the land that he's already illegally taken. But now that seems to be not necessarily the case. And I think Putin is quickly realizing that actually he could do very, very badly out of this lack of ceasefire, lack of a peace deal. And therefore, he is probably trying hard to make sure it happens and trying hard to make sure actually the Americans don't walk away from negotiations, which they're threatening to do, as soon as this week.
Does it mean that Vladimir Putin right now has no another option? He doesn't have any other option but to try to reach a ceasefire deal regarding the war in Ukraine due to the reasons you just mentioned about high casualties rate, economic problem, and also social pressure inside Russia?
Well, you would think so. In any normal democratic country, absolutely you would think so, with the casualty rates, the destruction of the economy. But we've got to know that these are not things that necessarily concern the Kremlin and necessarily concern Putin. I think he will keep going despite the level of casualties and everything else, until something dramatically changes. So we should not think that he has the same concerns as ourselves, and he will keep throwing his young men into the meat grinder to keep this war going unless he can get a peace deal on terms that he thinks are acceptable to him and those close to him in the Kremlin. But the chances are that that possibility is beginning to fade. It seems very likely that Ukraine and the Americans might well be signing this rare earth minerals deal this week. At least that's what Trump is saying. And that is what Trump is saying will really get him to focus very hard on the war and bringing it to an end. And if Putin doesn't want to be involved in the negotiations, the inference you get from it is that the Americans will make sure that Ukraine can prevail. And I think that's what most people are hoping will be the outcome.
And also, recently, more than 100 soldiers have fled from military base in the Krasnodar region. They tried to also escape from the conscription campaign and also escape from the Russian army to try to escape the battlefield. Also, do you see this could be the reason why Vladimir Putin is trying to seriously consider ceasefire option, because even many more soldiers are trying to realize that they're going to be put in this meat grinder?
Well, it is a brutal regime that the Russian army run. Barely trained young men are thrown into battle and are dying in unbelievably large amounts. And the way that the Russians do things, unlike the Ukraine army or the British army, where the officers lead at the front and are the first into the battle. In the Russian army, the officers are at the back shooting anybody who doesn't go forward. And this sort of brutal type of approach, not unsurprisingly, people are beginning to realize is something that they just do not want to be a part of. And as Russia finds it more and more difficult to get conscripts, they started off by using prisoners. They've sort of run out of prisoners. They're paying people, and people are just not coming forward. And the only other way to do it is to force people. But as a soldier myself for 35 years, I know that a forced soldier is probably the worst type of soldier you can have. And I think that's why the Russians are struggling. And this is a great opportunity, hopefully, for Ukraine and its allies to push this home and get a just peace deal for the Ukraine people.
Also, Ukraine has launched a devastating attack on Russia's missile brigade, which were responsible for the strike on Sumy, on the city of Sumy, killing 35 people. How do you assess this retaliation from the Ukrainian side? And also, do you believe that Russian army will finally learn this lesson that it is really illegal and not appropriate to kill civilians in the war?
Well, there are two important things to unpack here. First of all, the ability of the Ukraine military to strike deep into Russia at strategic targets. This is something that is increasing and something the Ukraine military are doing very well. And it's not just with intelligence and equipment provided by the Americans and the West. Ukraine is developing its own military capabilities and getting its own intelligence as well. And this is something that is improving, increasing as days go by. And I think the Russians are realizing that they're becoming more and more vulnerable, in Russia itself. And this will be a huge concern because the air defense assets that they need to defend these key locations just don't exist any longer. And the very few that they have, Putin and his officials are using to protect themselves. So this is likely to become a bigger and bigger headache, for the Russians as they go forward, as Ukraine gets better and better and better at this. And it's key to cutting off the logistic tail, as it were, that supports the frontline troops. And I am sure that as these attacks continue, the Russian troops in the front lines are going to, perform, worse and worse. And whatever we think of President Putin, he's not an idiot. He's been the dictator for 25 years or so. So he must be pretty bright, and he must realize that this is happening and things are beginning to turn against him in a pretty severe way.
Also, recently, Ukrainian army has repelled Russia's offensive full-scale attack in the south of Ukraine. Russia was using hundreds of soldiers, tanks and other armored vehicles. Do you feel that Russian army has already reached its culminating point? Because even this offensive in the south of Ukraine has failed, and Russia suffered another staggering casualties, enormous casualties.
I think that is largely the case. I think it's also the case that, Russia has tried to concentrate its forces, but to conduct tank warfare, or combined arms warfare, as we call it, takes a lot of training. When I trained my regiment to do this, it took over a year. The Russians are only taking days or weeks to try and train these forces. Therefore, they're just not effective. And now that the Ukraine army is well organized and has capabilities, it's been able to pick off these forces and prevent them making any ground. And I don't think there's any prospect in the future. There's lots of talk about Russia massing forces for some big attack, but that seems to be information coming out of Russia, not the reality. It occurs to me, or it's apparent to me that Ukraine pretty much has a good intelligence